Good morning. Could you please confirm that you're team 503?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. Well, welcome to Washington, D.C., and congratulations on making it to the final round of the Fiscal Challenge. My name is Phil Smith, and I'm the National Field Director for the Nonpartisan Concord Coalition, and I'm pleased to be your Emcee for today's competition. I will now, one final time, read the rules, just to make sure that you're well aware. You will have 15 minutes to present your plan. Those 15 minutes will include any time you wish to allocate to introductions. The judges will not ask questions during these 15 minutes. I will alert you when I start the timer. I will also alert you when you have 5 minutes to go, or 1 minute to go, and when time is up. I will be curt when the time is up and stop you mid-sentence. We will then transition to Q&A. You will have 15 minutes to field and address questions from our judges. If your team is answering a question when the time is called, I will let the person answering the question complete their thought. However, they may not switch to other thoughts, nor may other students contribute to the answer. Questions can include how you have incorporated recent events or releases that have occurred since your first round proposal. At no time during your presentation or Q&A should you reveal your individual names or school affiliation. You may only reveal your team number. Faculty advisors may be in the audience for both presentation and Q&A, but may not participate. Once your team has finished, you may join the audience to watch other teams. You may now begin. When you are ready, I will start the timer once you start speaking.
Hello, we are Team 503, and welcome to the 2025 Fiscal Masters, where we look to score low on the debt-to-GDP ratio. Our policies aim to promote fiscal responsibility, economic growth, and political feasibility.
According to the CBO, our nominal GDP stands at $30.1 trillion, projected to raise to $88.4 trillion by 2055, nearly a threefold increase. However, this economic expansion does not tell the full story.
Simultaneously, the national debt is expected to surge from $30.1 trillion in 2025 to a staggering $129.9 trillion by 2055. This will lead to a projected debt-to-GDP ratio of 146.9%, a trend that carries serious economic and fiscal consequences.
As the national debt increases, the government will be forced to allocate a larger share of resources towards servicing interest payments rather than investing in key public works like education, infrastructure, and defense. Over the next 30 years, interest payments are expected to rise from $810 billion in 2025 to over $4.3 trillion in 2055. Excessive government borrowing can also lead to higher interest rates, making it harder for consumers and businesses to access capital. This crowding out effect could reduce private investment, slowing down long-term economic growth and innovation.
The U.S. fiscal deficit currently stands at $1.7 trillion, and projections indicate it will balloon to $5.8 trillion by 2055. This growing imbalance between government spending and revenue underscores significant fiscal and economic challenges that must be addressed through strategic policy interventions. Moody's estimates the U.S. will spend 30% of its revenue on paying interest on its debt by 2035. Additionally, the deficit as a percent of GDP stands at over 6%.
Our goal is to lower the debt-to-GDP ratio to 95% in order to maintain our financial credibility. The golf cart graphic at the bottom of the screen demonstrates our progress towards the goal, as represented by the flag.
We will present our most fiscally impactful policies first, followed by policies with immediate impact. Finally, we end with our least impactful policies.
The sweeping policy impacts mean nothing, however, unless they're politically feasible. Our package will thus require support from both the executive branch and both houses in Congress. We will use a model to individually score our policy based on their partisan support. This model considers data from the voter rolls of relevant past bills, as well as the voting tendencies of the 8 congressional ideological subgroups identified by 538.
For instance, the model factors in the tendency of an ideological subgroup called the compromised conservatives to vote against foreign aid or spending bills. By inputting this data, we can project an estimated vote count for a given policy and thus score each policy based on party support. Like golf, lower numbers are better, so 1 signifies the most support and 5 the least support. To be considered feasible in our model, the cumulative scores for both Democratic and Republican policies must amount to 27 or less.
Reducing the debt-to-GDP ratio to 95% will be a tall task, But just like a powerful drive of the D, some policies take big swings to reshape the economy. Our long game sets up the perfect fairway position for long-term fiscal sustainability. So let's start with some heavy-hitting policies to get the ball rolling.
First, we propose an energy policy that will be a sweeping effort to unleash the potential of a cleaner and modernized energy infrastructure for America. We propose a complete privatization of the nuclear industry and a 20% subsidy for the initial investment in new reactor and enrichment facility construction.
We also propose the deregulation of critical mineral mining that would contribute to a new uranium and critical mineral stockpile. This effort will decrease American dependence on Chinese critical minerals and refined uranium. Despite the high initial investment to facilitate construction, nuclear infrastructure will drive the U.S. to a GDP boost of $5.5 trillion and lower the debt to GDP ratio by 7.8 percentage points over the next 30 years. Based on the 2024 Advanced Acts voter roll, most Democrats and most Republicans would support this policy.
The next goal is a daunting one, Social Security reform. According to the Peterson Foundation, the Social Security Trust Fund is expected to be depleted by 2034. We must shape our shots like Tiger on this war in order to navigate the headwinds of political feasibility to find a sustainable revision.
Our first reform indexes Social Security payments to 125% of the federal poverty line beginning in 2035. Higher earners would have enough time to adjust their savings and plan for a reduction in Social Security payments.
We also propose raising the full retirement age to 70 for workers currently 45 years and younger. Workers that are planning to retire in the next 20 years could choose to retire at 70 and receive Social Security benefits at 150% of the poverty line instead of a revised number of 125%, incentivizing more people to retire later.
Our reform will eliminate the disproportionate distribution of income and incentivize private retirement solutions for higher earners while enhancing income security for lower income retirees. Our reforms would reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 9.2 percentage points by saving $8.04 trillion over 30 years.
The current state and local tax deduction cap, also known as SALT, of $10,000 disproportionately benefits high-income earners in high-tax states while reducing federal revenue. Similarly, charitable deductions currently lack a threshold. The proposed reform lowers the SALT deduction cap to $5,875 for individuals and $11,750 for joint filers. Additionally, it introduces a 2% adjusted gross income floor for charitable deductions, ensuring that only substantial contributions yield tax benefits, encouraging high-income donors to contribute more meaningfully. Together, these reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 8 percentage points. This tax reform would be supported by legislators on both sides of the aisle from low-tax states, but opposed from their counterparts from high-tax states.
According to the 2017 Council of Economic Advisors, substantial land deregulation reform would boost annual U.S. GDP by 2.3%. We propose tying federal funding for affordable housing to states and municipalities enacting substantial housing reform. Our policy would incentivize the elimination of single-family zoning and minimum lot sizes and the adoption of online permitting and permanent timelines, expediting construction. This policy reduces the debt to GDP ratio by 12 percentage points. We can anticipate most Republicans and some moderate Democrats to favor this policy due to its free market lean, but there may be some conservatives from suburban districts that could vote against this policy.
We're off to a great start reducing the debt to GDP ratio thanks to our high-impact policies that are driving us to our goal. Let's continue to medium-impact policies that'll help us place the ball where it needs to be.
Implementing a carbon tax with a 15-year delay would provide industries ample time to transition, further incentivizing a shift towards nuclear energy. We suggest CBO's policy of a $25 tax per metric ton of emissions at a 5% per year increase. We aim not only to slow the ongoing rise in carbon emissions, but also lower the debt by $4.21 trillion and reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 4.7 percentage points.
According to the National Institute of Health, applying a $25 per metric ton tax at a 5% per year increase would lower demand for emission-intensive energy sources like coal and oil. This policy would be supported by most Democrats, but no Republicans. While unfeasible on its own, pairing this policy with nuclear investment and other conservative policies in our package will help it pass. It also serves as a bargaining chip for Democrats to be more supportive of this policy package overall.
In 2024, Medicare cost the U.S. government over $912 billion, making it the nation's second most expensive program. Building on the Inflation Reduction Act, expanding rebates to more drugs and private plans while streamlining FDA approval for generics and biosimilars could enhance affordability and cut Medicare costs by $28 billion annually. This aspect of the policy would gain strong Democratic support and some moderate Republicans willing to cross the aisle. Additionally, freezing Medicare income levels to increase premiums will save $22 billion a year.
Finally, by allowing private plans to compete with traditional Medicare promotes Medicare Advantage, enhancing competition and preventative care. Beneficiaries will pay the difference for pricier plans or receive a rebate for cheaper ones. Republicans would support this facet of the reform. This package altogether would be moderately supported by both sides after legislative negotiations, saving $95 billion yearly and reducing the debt to GDP ratio by 5.1 percentage points.
We're almost to our goal of reducing debt to GDP ratio to 95%. Now it is time to get out the butter to finish the job with some targeted policies.
The military is financially in the bunker. We first proposed a gradual cut of $959 billion over 10 years, giving the military enough time to prepare to adjust spending efficiently. Then, the increase in defense spending from the 11th year would be chained to real GDP growth. Due to the Pentagon's prominent budget accountability issues, this policy will also create a budget allocation system in which the three main branches of the Defense Department compete for funding. Each branch will be audited every year, and the worst performing branch will forfeit 3% of its budget to the best performing branch.
Audits will continue until 70% of DoD assets are accounted for, compared to just 37% now. If any branch fails an audit at any time, the competition will resume. This policy will reduce spending by $1.8 trillion over 30 years and lower the debt to GDP ratio by 2.1 percentage points. While Republicans within the old guard would oppose this policy, we expect other Republicans and most Democrats to support the accountability aspect of it.
This next policy aims to privatize several government entities such as Amtrak and USPS. Amtrak continues to be a boondoggle to the expenditure, losing $2 billion per year and soaking up $5 billion in federal subsidies annually. Privatization should boost operational efficiency and thus boost GDP. The post office is also in the red, losing $5.4 billion annually. Privatization would cut this cost and incentivize competition and innovation in the sector, such as cost-effective and adaptable employment models used by existing companies like FedEx and UPS. This would eliminate $1.45 trillion from the budget deficit and reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 1.6 percentage points.
Our last policy aims to reform immigration by reallocating the employment-based green cards to the EB1 and EB2 categories. These categories include immigrants that show outstanding abilities in their research fields. An increased percentage of EB1 and EB2 immigrants from the issued amount of employment-based green cards allows the U.S. to increase productivity. Furthermore, we argue that with the recent surge in AI, there will be more openings for highly skilled workers in the STEM field. The economic impact of our policy will increase the earnings of employment-based immigrants, leading to projected tax revenues of $2.4 trillion by 2055, and reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 2.8 percentage points. We anticipate that this would be supported by some moderate Republicans and most Democrats.
We have now finished out the round. We've successfully lowered our debt to GDP ratio to 93.6%, clearing the objective of 95%. Of course, since these calculations are estimates, a margin of error is expected. In the best case scenario, the debt to GDP ratio will fall further to 87.2% by the year 2055. However, in the worst case scenario, it could end at 98.9%.
As previously mentioned, we can estimate that the policy package can be reasonably passed through Congress if it scores a 27 or less on the partisan scorecard for both parties. Democrats score a 27 and Republicans score a 22, indicating our policy's feasibility. Republicans' greater support than Democrats helps the package's viability given Republicans' current unified control of government. Some policies, like the carbon tax, would likely not pass if voted on individually. However, we believe that our portfolio of policies is politically feasible if bundled together as an omnibus package. Now, let's look at how key demographics are affected by our policies.
Low-income retirees will benefit from flattened Social Security, while high-income retirees will lose benefits that they do not significantly depend on. Older workers will largely be unaffected due to our policy's delayed implementation, but younger professionals will be incentivized to save more in 401ks and IRA programs.
Rural Americans will be affected by post office privatization, as we anticipate the closure of some low-demand locations. However, we do not believe that this is a significant issue, considering that the least demanded 4,500 locations of the USPS only serve 4.4 customers per day. That said, increased American energy production driven by nuclear power should allow for improved access to the energy needed for the rural economy and lifestyles.
Decreasing the SALT cap will hurt high earners residing in high-tax states, but this higher net tax should decrease income inequality. Decentralization of nuclear, rail, and Medicare will give high earners more opportunities to invest and thus grow their existing capital.
Low-income Americans will benefit from our Social Security reforms. In addition, they will also benefit from lower housing prices and lower rents from our land reform policy.
Some of these aforementioned policy consequences might be adverse for many Americans, so why enact these policies? In 2024, the United States violated the Ferguson Law, which occurs when a country spends a higher percentage of GDP on debt servicing than on defense. This law states that crossing this threshold indicates an impending power decline. Exposing ourselves to a prolonged period of fiscal imbalance thus risks becoming a national security issue in the near future, hence the need for our reforms.
Moreover, America's financial credibility is a key factor that makes the U.S. the wealthiest and strongest nation in the world. Our good credit standing enables easy financial transactions domestically and internationally. However, the increased debt to GDP ratio stresses our credibility. Therefore, to maintain this privilege, we must prioritize fiscal responsibility in government.
In conclusion, all proposals make federal spending more efficient and sustainable, unleash America's energy production, and boost productivity through skilled immigration and affordable housing. Along with reducing our debt, all policies make the American economy more dynamic and equitable, ensuring we stay on course for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Team 503. At this time, we will transition to our Q&A and turn it over to our esteemed panel of judges.
Okay, I can go first. I wanted to talk a little bit about your land deregulation policy. So land use is often thought of as a sort of local purview. So how does the federal government affect the land use deregulation? How did you consider how those policies would work?
Yeah, of course. So when it comes to kind of pursuing land deregulation, obviously we want to look at zoning and other aspects of that. However, we do believe that the federal government can play a role and can work to enact these policy reforms by tying certain policy changes on the state level or on the local level to the distribution of certain federal grants. And we do believe that there is precedent for this historically, and this is how we think the federal government can kind of implement these sorts of policies overall.
Specifically, we plan to target affordable housing and transportation grants to the state and local governments, and we would mandate that they adopt these national reforms, getting rid of single-family zoning, minimum lot sizes, and expediting the construction process to obtaining these grants.
And specifically, we're looking at the 1987 precedent set by South Dakota versus Dole, which basically stipulated that the federal government is allowed to use grants in order to push the state legislatures into forwarding certain policies.
But let me just jump in and ask then, how much would these grants cost?
These are from the existing budget. So we would just be using as a carrot and stick to incentivize these state and local governments to adopt these policies.
So I want to talk about healthcare. That's the it's a large and rapidly growing area of the budget. You had proposals on Medicare. Could you talk about what you thought about with respect to non-Medicare healthcare and why you might not have included options on that?
Yeah, so we primarily kind of went after Medicare, obviously, because it's one of the larger portions of the federal budget, and we specifically avoided Medicaid or other potential medical healthcare proposals just because of the political feasibility aspect of it. We're already kind of addressing Social Security reform, and so we wanted to avoid any other sort of policy changes that could potentially be viewed as regressive and could potentially negatively impact the political feasibility of our overall omnibus package.
I have a question about distributional effects. I was surprised in your discussion of distributional effects to not see the carbon tax mentioned. Have you thought about the distributional effects of implementing your carbon tax?
Yeah, when we were implementing our tax reform, we thought of like a less distortionary, equitable form of like increasing energy to reduce prices. That's where a nuclear investment policy comes in. That really boosts production of carbon-free energy, like lowering prices, and to further incentivize like how the two policies interact with each other, to further incentivize the shift towards nuclear energy, we would implement the carbon tax after 15 years. So that way we could
Could you guys go to your the projected debt to GDP ratio at the end of your policies? What kind of struck me with this chart is how rapidly the debt to GDP ratio declines. Basically, you guys are reducing the debt to GDP ratio, noticeably over the next 5 years. Could you explain what about your modeling, what about the policy choices that you guys made results in that kind of quick effect?
Yeah, I can start off with explaining the model. And so we took the CBO's budgetary outlook from 2025 to 2055, and then the nominal GDP, interest spending, debt projections, and then increased it year on year with a 2% real GDP increase, and then modeled the effect of our policies against these baseline projections on an annual basis and summed it up, and that's how we found the numbers for like each policy's effect on our model. But if you look at it initially, like for the first 5 years, that's due to like some of the policies being started earlier and some of the policies being phased in. So that's where like the change comes in.
Additionally, there are certain policies, as we've mentioned, that are phased in, but a lot of more significant affecting policies are going to be implemented pretty much immediately. So for instance, we think that land deregulation would have a very strong immediate effect in lowering housing costs. And then additionally, while the price of, or the investment in nuclear infrastructure, while building new reactors would take quite a long time, we think there's a lot of room to create energy capacity by recommissioning decommissioned nuclear reactors, which essentially these reactors, many of which have been decommissioned for political reasons. All of the red tape has already been cut. The permitting has already been in place because they've been existing reactors. So we think just by getting them online within about 2 years would be the scheduling for that. We can get those back up and running and very significantly lower energy costs, which would contribute to the GDP growth that we project.
And then just zooming out big picture, we recognize that there's a lot of uncertainty with our policy projections, which is why we've incorporated these upside and downside scenarios. They reflect both our policies themselves, but also in macroeconomy factors where GDP might grow a little bit faster or interest rates are higher than we expected in the future with these projections.
While we're on this chart, I have to ask, what's up with the increase at the end?
Oh yeah, so that's usually like our phasing out of our land deregulation policy. So we realized that the initial effects of land deregulation will be much higher than the later on effects. And so like as we phase the policies out over the last 5 years, that's why we see the jump in.
One thought that occurred to me in looking at the partisan score and the options is that there might have been dials that could be turned to make them more attractive to the party where they're less popular. So if we could go to the Social Security slide for a moment. I recall that being relatively more attractive to Republicans, yes, than Democrats. And the options that you have here are indeed things that would appeal more to Republicans than Democrats. Have you considered additional options that might shift that a little bit? And why did you not include them, or what did you think about?
One of the options that we considered was raising the Social Security tax and the payroll tax. That obviously would have been a little bit more appealing to Democrats. But we decided against that because we were worried about some distortionary effects in the labor market and productivity, as that might disincentivize some people to work less in the future. And ultimately, we felt that our other policies would be more would accommodate this largely unattractive Social Security reform for Democrats.
Additionally, I think it's important to recognize that the united control of both Congress and the executive branch is in favor of Republicans. So we did want our overall policy package to be a little bit more favorable to a conservative priorities. So I think this is one of many policies that kind of indicate that.
And in addition to that, even though this policy may seem hawkish to the Democrats, currently 75% of beneficiaries receive above 100% of the federal poverty guideline, while 26% of beneficiaries receive above 200%, and therefore we believe that the Social Security has deviated from its original intent, which was to protect Americans from income insecurity due to old age. And so it has significantly deviated from that, and therefore we believe that this reform is justified in a way.
To add on to that political feasibility, we looked into certain locations as where these politicians are representing to their states. And additionally to that, we looked into the ideological subcommittees that they are in. For example, we have one called the far-right obstructionists, and what they look at is at libertarian policies and less of government spending. So we want to make sure, specifically with the political feasibility, that we were able to look into it. And in addition to that, it helps us with the overall policy overall package of the policy to be politically feasible, especially during this time.
I have a follow-up question while we're on Social Security. So the last bullet point is about incentivizing private retirement investment, and I wondered sort of what were the aspects of that? Is it merely that now I, as a person who might retire in 2035, would I be getting a tax benefit for increasing investment in things that might fund my retirement 10 years from now? Or is it just that because I can't be expecting as big a Social Security check that I'm going to have to save more?
Our belief with that is that high-income earners, they have enough income stability for them to not focus and rely on Social Security. Like we said, the original purpose was to have coverage for income insecurity, and we think that because of that, people will go towards private investment rather than focusing on their Social Security.
But no additional tax benefit?
There would be no additional tax benefits, but we do believe that that's why we work in the delay. And so one of the populations that would be more kind of, I guess you could argue, negatively impacted by our overall policies would be more like, I guess you could say, middle-aged workers in blue states that would be hit by the brunt of our SALT reform policies and potentially our Social Security reform, along with land deregulation, which could deflate the value of their homes. However, we do believe that, again, that this is just something that is fiscally necessary, especially looking at the future with the Social Security Trust expecting to, again, just not be sustainable moving forward.
I think that I would also add that I think the final bullet up there about the incentives is more of a result of making our Social Security guideline flat. If we have higher or middle high and higher earners getting less out of Social Security than what they expected, they're going to want to use their money to find a higher upside anyway, just as a result of that. So they're going to be naturally incentivized to shift over to more of an investment oriented retirement plan rather than wholly relying on Social Security.
So how did that play into the economic growth assumptions that you had? If you've got a bunch of people who are now saving rather than spending that money, did that play into your expectations about how this proposal would?
I'm not. I would think that, or our policy actually expects them to be more into investing their money rather than saving it for the future in bank accounts, right? And I think a lot of our policies, particularly through privatization in particular, and also land deregulation, provide some opportunities for some investment, especially for higher earning individuals. They can use some of that money that they would have saved in bank accounts to invest and get a higher upside early or down the line in 10 years when they do retire.
In addition to that, we believe that this can lead to also more due diligence by individuals when investing, therefore leading to more efficient allocation in the American economy towards investments, towards the right investments.
And one thing that we do think is important to consider when it comes to this policy is that there are many people who are not in a position to save or even invest for retirement. And so our proposed policy reform, by tying it to above the federal poverty line, these Social Security payments, we're actually expected to lift over 2 million senior citizens out of poverty who are currently past the retirement age. So we think that adds value to our proposal overall to kind of, again, address those distortionary effects that exist within the current Social Security system.
And finally, we do have a second incentive for those workers who are within that kind of middle age range. We do have this incentive to retire later at the age of 70, and they can collect even larger Social Security benefits. So that's just another incentive that we have to kind of shield those individuals from maybe more negative effects of this policy.
So you guys mentioned the economy, thinking about economic growth and Social Security, among other things. But let's just assume we go into a recession tomorrow. Would that change the timing, how you all would be thinking about the timing and implementation of any of your plans?
Before we start, go to the last slide in which we spoke about the margin of error. If the economy had to go into recession, we are obviously accounting for the downside in that policies, where the uncertainty plays out when GDP growth slows down, and so debt to GDP ratio increases. That's we plotted on in the worst case scenario. But in terms of policy implementation, for example, charitable giving, the floor, we would probably phase that in later on, because we don't want to be disincentivizing giving to the poor in that recessionary period. Yeah.
I think if you also look at our policies, yes, our entitlement reform and our taxes reform would not necessarily be helpful during a recession, but the biggest increases that's helped reducing the debt to GDP is coming from GDP boosters, so from housing, from energy, from immigration. And all those policies would be incredibly helpful during the recession to boost consumption, boost investment, and get us out of the downturn.
Team 503, your time has expired.
Perfect.
Thank you for your presentation.